Istanbul, 1908. The Ottoman Sultan awoke to discover that his authority had been curtailed by men who claimed they were restoring the empire rather than destroying it. The revolution did not come from foreign armies. It came from officers, bureaucrats, and intellectuals who believed constitutional order could rescue a declining state. Among them were individuals whose families carried an older and more complicated inheritance. They were recorded as Muslims. They attended mosque. They participated in civic and commercial life. Yet within their households persisted the memory of a man who, in 1666, had proclaimed himself the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, and then, under pressure from the Ottoman court, converted publicly to Islam. For more than 2 centuries, his followers' descendants had lived in the narrow space between open conformity and private distinction. In the 17th century, Sabbatai Zevi's claim spread rapidly through Jewish communities across the Mediterranean world. His sudden conversion shocked those who had believed in him. Many abandoned the movement immediately. A smaller group chose another path. Rather than renounce him, they reinterpreted his conversion as part of a hidden divine design. What appeared to be capitulation could be understood as descent. By entering Islam, they reasoned, the Messiah had entered impurity in order to redeem it from within. That interpretation required adjustment. It demanded patience. It required secrecy. Those who remained loyal followed Zevi into Islam. Outwardly, they accepted Muslim names and practices. Privately, they preserved distinctive teachings rooted in Sabbatean thought. Certain dates associated with Zevi's life were marked quietly. Liturgical language was adapted in subtle ways. Interpretations of Jewish law were retained symbolically rather than formally. Marriage largely remained within the community, reinforcing cohesion across generations. Knowledge was transmitted unevenly, often restricted to trusted elders. The Ottoman authorities classified them simply as Muslims. Rabbinic authorities regarded them as apostates beyond communal return. They occupied an ambiguous place, neither fully embraced nor entirely excluded. Movements born of failed prophecy rarely survive long, yet the followers who came to be known as the Dönmeh did not dissolve. Their endurance rested on discipline. Belief became less an argument to be defended and more an inheritance to be managed. Children did not debate doctrine. They absorbed fragments of memory shaped by caution. Some were entrusted with deeper instruction, others received little beyond custom. Internal divisions emerged over time. Karakash, Kapanja, Yakubi, each tracing legitimacy through differing lines of interpretation. Though divided, they shared an understanding that continuity depended on discretion. Salonica, a thriving port city in the late Ottoman period, became their principal center. There they prospered in commerce, finance, and education. The city's cosmopolitan character provided both opportunity and cover. Modern schools flourished alongside religious institutions. Trade connected the city to Europe, to the Balkans, to ports further west. Salonica was alive with languages, currencies, newspapers, and ideas. Within this environment, the Dönmeh developed reputations as urban, educated, and commercially capable. They entered banking houses, they managed textile firms. They sent their children to modern academies where science and philosophy were taught alongside scripture. Their relative success did not erase curiosity. If anything, it sharpened it. Their preference for marriage within the group, their distinct burial grounds, their reluctance to offer public explanation, invited quiet scrutiny. They were visible, yet opaque, present, yet withholding. They responded not with confrontation and not with public defense, but with reserve. Questions were met with deflection. Rumors were allowed to exhaust themselves. Silence became habit. Habit became structure. And structure became protection. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire faced mounting strain. The stability that had allowed such ambiguity to persist was beginning to erode. Territorial losses, military setbacks, economic dependency on European powers. Confidence in imperial permanence began to falter. Reformers argued that constitutional governance might stabilize what remained, that modern administration, elected representation, and legal reform could restore credibility to a weakening state. In 1908, officers associated with what became known as the Young Turk movement compelled the restoration of the constitution. Salonica served as a focal point for organizing and coordination. Apartments became meeting halls, printing presses worked after midnight. Ideas traveled quietly across professional networks. Within this political climate, individuals from Dönmeh families participated as reformists, journalists, teachers, or administrators. Their involvement reflected education, opportunity, and circumstance rather than collective design. But in periods of instability, nuance fades. Difference becomes conspicuous. Rumor travels easily when institutions falter. Old suspicions resurfaced, not as formal accusations, but as insinuations. The language of secrecy returned, and with it, familiar unease. Events soon altered the physical foundations of their community. During the Balkan Wars of 1912, Salonica passed from Ottoman to Greek control. Flags changed, administrations changed, borders shifted. The city that had anchored their communal density was no longer within the same political framework that had shaped their history. For a community sustained by proximity, that shift mattered. A decade later, the Treaty of Lausanne formalized a compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Religion, not language or culture, became the measure of belonging. Orthodox Christians moved to Greece. Muslims moved to Turkey. The Dönmeh were counted as Muslims and relocated accordingly. Entire neighborhoods were emptied, homes were abandoned, cemeteries were left behind. Families dispersed across Istanbul, Izmir, Ankara, and other Turkish cities. The concentrated environment that had sustained their internal boundaries fragmented. What had been reinforced by closeness would now be tested by distance. The early Turkish Republic introduced sweeping secular reforms. The caliphate was abolished, religious courts were dismantled, educational and legal systems were reorganized. Public expressions of religious authority were curtailed in favor of national identity. External pressure had once reinforced internal cohesion. Now public religious identity carried diminished weight. Without the reinforcing tension of suspicion or exclusion, certain practices gradually weakened. Dispersion made endogamy more difficult to maintain. Intermarriage increased. Some families preserved fragments of memory. Others allowed difference to fade. They did not vanish in spectacle. They thinned into ordinary life. Names remained, stories faded, memories were kept in some families, and quietly released in others. What had once required vigilance became ancestry. What had once required secrecy became history. Across 3 centuries they adapted, not by declaring themselves and not by resisting the world around them, but by adjusting to it. Empire gave way to republic, revolution gave way to reform, suspicion gave way to indifference, and with indifference came something unexpected: relief. History often remembers movements that burn brightly and collapse. It records rebellions, proclamations, and dramatic endings. It is less attentive to what survives by softening. The Dönmeh did not conquer. They did not disappear. They changed, and in changing, they endured. Their story is not one of hidden power, nor of tragic extinction. It is the quieter story of a community that learned how to remain by becoming indistinguishable from the world around it. And it all began with one false prophet, the Messiah who abandoned his people. Sabbatai Zevi.